Okay, so that's what stress is, the different types of stress. So what happens when we encounter a stressor? What do we do? Okay, well, this is where we're going to get some cool flashbacks into previous things we've talked about, which is kind of cool. Stressful experiences like this initiate a fight or flight response, which is something we've talked about a few times in this course. So let's remember back to our neuroscience lecture. So we talked briefly about the autonomic nervous system, that automatic system that you don't have to control. It's involuntary, right? It's kind of like your autopilot. And it's made up of either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous systems, right? So what I'm showing you here is that S word. The S word that we said reminded you of stress, that stress response. Well, it's coming back. It's your fight or flight response, and it prepares your body for intense physical activity. It's preparing your body for action, for dealing with that stress. So that's exactly what happens. We respond to stress by having an increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, higher respiration and breathing. And we stop those kind of non-essential bodily functions, those functions that are handled by the parasympathetic nervous system, things like digestion, for instance. So yeah, this is kind of what happens when physically, when we have that kind of stress response. And there's kind of a model that Hans Selye, a person, developed called the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, which is kind of a model describing how we respond to stressors. And just kind of some backstory where this came from. So this individual was looking at the effects of stress in rats. So in mouse models, you can kind of do more of a hands-on kind of manipulation to see what stress does. So he exposed rats to a variety of different stressors for the rat. And you might be like, what stresses out a rat, right? So this is things like maybe being put in ice cold freezing water. This could be like an electric shock, if you think back to the learning chapter. This could be like mild surgery, like having your whiskers cut off, for instance. So these are things that do not long-term harm the animal, but is enough to kind of activate that fight or flight type of response. So after he stressed out the rats in these different ways, he then observed the amount of time. He put them in like a little pool, I think, and he observed the amount of time that they could keep swimming without giving up, how much they could tolerate that stressor. So here's the pattern that he noticed. Regardless of what stressor he used, there's this kind of three-step process. So first, there's alarm. So this is basically when the stressor happens and your body's like, oh, hey, like, like sound the alarms, like there's something going on that I need to pay attention to. So once we get this alarm, our body immediately tries to resist. So we try to fight that stressor. We try to, work harder, paddle faster. We try to undo whatever this thing is, fight or flight. We get away from the thing or we fight the thing. We try to resist that stress. But ultimately, as I'm sure known as you're studying for exams, for hours and hours on end, or if you've had one of those days where just hassles in a row until you get to the very end of the day, you can't do that forever. You can't just fight or flight or resist a stressor forever. Eventually, our body is going to become exhausted. So these are kind of the three main stages of a stress response. And he was noting kind of how across time these different stages occurred. So starting off with the alarm stage, which is initiated here on the x-axis, we have across time. And this is how much you resist the stress. So positive, like more resistance is on top and less resistance is on bottom. So you might just have like, this is your normal baseline amount of stress. And as soon as a stressor is perceived, as soon as, your body sounds that alarm, all of a sudden it's going to just throw you off your game. You're not going to be able to resist it very easily right away. You're going to dip down. And this whole period is characterized by your sympathetic nervous system arousal. So, doing all those heart rate, breathing types of automatic functions, and also overall mental clarity. So you need to be able to assess your environment. and it's that fight or flight kind of response. So as you're alarming, you're starting to get a little bit better at resisting that stress. And then we get to resistance. So here's where you start to cope with it. You're like, okay, I've assessed, I know what this alarming stressor is. You can see that you're starting to increase and peak at your resistance. You're getting better at resisting that stress. But again, we're not perfect superhero super beings because we can only do that for a certain designated period of time. So after, stressors are what we call prolonged, so they're lasting for a while. If you can, if you have like, I don't know, a spider that's stressing you out in the corner and then you can smash it and you're done, you might not go through all these stages. But if you have a stressor that's prolonged, maybe you're studying for an exam or you're working a couple jobs to make a living, you're going to be able to resist that for a little bit. But ultimately, you're going to end in exhaustion. So this is characterized by depletion of all your physical, your psychological, mental resources. And your strength, your resistance to stress, you can see just plummets to very low levels because you've used up all of your cognitive and physical resources here. So these are kind of your three main stages of how we might go through a general stress response.